with us. This is a great book. Anything he does, I'm a huge fan of. This is the launch event. It's nice to see some familiar faces from the juggling event last year. Stuart has a great show for you tonight. I'm going to take it away. I'm going to be selling books afterwards, and he'll be signing them just like last time.
Thank you so much. So again, I'm Stuart Sinclair. I believe most of you know me in one capacity or the other, but for those of you who might not, I am a semi-professional juggler and a professional writer, and you're here today to learn about one half of that. Now, we're going to try and make this work here. There's a couple videos we're going to show and stuff. If any of them don't come through, just bear with us. We're kind of working on funky technology, but again, want to thank Bart's Books for everything that they did for pulling this together. Yes. So round of applause. We're going to start this off just by a little bit of background. If we could go to the next slide. You got this. No, that's the wrong way to do it. See? I think we need to... Hang on one second, everybody. He's new.
First day on the job.
Okay, there we go. So, here's Space Rover. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how this book came about, but first I wanted to do a little bit to talk about sort of the situation that we ended up in this box here today. We can go to the next slide. There's 70 slides, so you're going to hear next slide a lot. I used to have a clicker and it failed. So, this guy is named Guillaume L'Agentille.
Wait, that's a guy?
It is a guy. And he was a 17th century astronomer who wanted to see a thing called the transit of Venus. So you can see this little dot here, and this is Venus transiting the sun, meaning moving across the surface of the sun, right? But from our perspective. Now to see that, he had to sail from France all the way to Pondicherry in India. And when he got there, he found out that Pondicherry had been overthrown by the British, so he couldn't land, and he missed the transit. Next slide. There's Pondicherry. That's all you need to know. Next slide. So this became known in the understatement of the century as the ordeal of Guillaume L'Agentille. That is the fate which often attends astronomers, exiling myself from my motherland only to be the spectator of a fatal cloud which arrived in front of the sun at the precise moment of my observation, snatching from me the fruit of my efforts and exertions. So, he goes to Malabar, off the coast of India, and he starts exploring flora and fauna for 8 years. Because that transit happens once every 8 years, twice, and then not again for another 106 years. That's the whole cycle. So the whole world was very excited about this. He goes to Malabar, and as he's there, he gets a letter in the mail. Not in the mail, I don't know how you get letters back then, quite frankly, but he gets a letter saying, yeah, the Pony Express on a boat. He gets a letter saying that you can come back to Pondicherry. You know, we have finally set up, we threw the bricks out, thank God, and just come on over, you can watch, we have a great view. So he comes back, he builds an observatory, and the hour that the transit happens, it's cloudy. He sees nothing. So he's pretty bummed, but not as bummed as he becomes when he goes home and finds that he's been gone so long that his wife has left him for somebody else. His entire fortune has been taken away because he's been left for dead by the government, and he's lost his status as a scientist in society. And that is what it means to be an astronomer. Next slide. So, I'm not sure if this is going to play. I'm going to come over here and try this real quick, and that's not going to work necessarily. We had a video of an eclipse. I had just gone up to Ithaca in New York to see the latest eclipse, and we get there, and of course, it's cloudy. And all I saw, next slide, was this. But it was still beautiful. Okay, so it passes over in its entirety, and as it goes dark, all of a sudden all these birds come out of nowhere, and I was with a friend whose baby just freaked out, started crying, panicking, hides her face like it's the middle of the day, the sun's gone, and she had thought that object permanence was settled by then. She didn't think the sun was one of those things that disappears midday, and it goes away. So, moving forward one more slide. I came back to California very excited about the sunny weather, very excited about an outdoor event at Bart's Books, very excited to have this telescope I literally bought last week to do a big outdoor stargazing event, and here's today. So sometimes you get screwed. And again, that is the lesson of science. But I'm so glad to be here today, and I'm so glad that you guys all came out for the weather and to talk about space rovers. So we'll go on to the next slide, and a bit of the origins of this book. So this is the product of kind of two things that happened that coalesced during the pandemic. So during the pandemic in 2020, the Perseverance rover was launched into space, and I had just finished my other book, Juggling, and I was trying to think about what to do next, and it hit me that there was a series called Object Lessons that I had a connection to through a friend, and I've been trying to come up with an object to talk about for years. So the Perseverance rover goes up, and it hits me that that's the one I want to talk about because I remember something that happened in 2017, which you may all be familiar with. If we can go to the next slide. The Thomas Fire. This was a video. There are some videos I'm going to try to play, other videos I'm not going to try because we have limited time and I'm not going to spend it all on tech support stuff. But this was a video looking at the ridge over John Brandt's house, who's in the audience today. Of course, hit play. Thank you. So again, terrifying. I think everybody in this room, or most people in this room, were probably here at that time. And as this is going on, I was actually out of the country, and I'm watching Ventura burn from a distance. And as I hear about this, I learned that it's coming up to my Uncle Alan's ranch in Carpinteria. He has a little avocado ranch up there. If you go to the next slide. Oh, we can watch it burn again if you want. There we go. So we'll get to the avocado ranch in a minute, but this was the view from John's backyard after the fire. And there's a word for this that firefighters use. Anyone want to guess what that word is?
Burnt.
That's one.
Denuded.
Next, what's that?
Denuded.
Denuded would work.
Scarred.
Destroyed, scarred. Next slide. Moonscaped. That is the word for that total and complete evisceration of every living thing in sight. And here you have one of our Apollo astronauts on the moon, and if you haven't noticed, little friend over here. So as this fire is going on, as my uncle's avocado orchard is burning, or is being threatened, as his farm, his home is being threatened, I come home and move to the next slide, and we visit the ranch. And so here you can just see some of the plants on the ranch. This is his lucky horseshoe, or a lucky horseshoe, I assume. I don't know if he thought it was lucky at all, but it was there. Next slide. This was inside his barn. Now, as you can see, the TV actually burned all around the outside, but it still worked, and Cox Cable seemed to have been successful in that endeavor as well. Next slide. These are some other objects. That's the front end of a Studebaker or something like that. My dad would probably actually know what kind of car it is. And a clock that survived it, but the face melted off here. A motorcycle up in the corner that's burning. And mind you, this was all after he actually cleaned up his garage. So most things were toasted, but some things were brought back in later. Next slide. And among the things that were burned or didn't burn in that garage, he says to me at one moment, "Come look over here." And as I look at a box in the corner that he lifts up and puts on the bed of his truck, it's full of photographs. And among those photographs, which include family photos, there's a photo of my dad pitching horseshoes and drinking a beer, are all these photos from this man right here. This is Alden Fogliadine. So that is our great-grandfather in a convoluted, complicated, big family sort of way. And he was a machinist who worked on this here. That being, this is a prototype of the Mars rover. A couple ways you can tell that is that this has pneumatic or rubber tires instead of metal tires.
Moon rover, not Mars.
Sorry, Moon rover. Thank you, Dad. So this was one of the photos in that box. And next slide. And this was another one. I believe he drew this one. He was an artist as well, but I don't know for sure. Nothing was signed. But there are reasons that this also would have just been a sketch, because there are things that you might recognize from the rovers that aren't here, but it's pretty recognizable as that object, obviously, and you can tell it's on the moon. And this leads me to the first reading that I'm going to offer tonight. Welcome, everybody. Come on through. Hello, hello. I think we have some seats there.
Oh no, sorry.
This is where you hit pause.
The nice thing about a picture is it's automatically paused.
But can you rewind?
I will rewind the picture. Okay, so again, this is where the book ended up starting. Is we see these pictures, and then come 2020, I just have this memory, and it hits me that this is going to be a book that's not just about moon rovers, but about climate change and about the precariousness of life on this planet. And the happenstance way that in a fire, for instance, there's no rhyme or reason to what burns and what survives, who suffers and who doesn't. Of course, in a grand scale, there is much rhyme and much reason, but on an individual level, any of us can become victims to what we are doing to this planet. So, the fire reached the ranch about 4 days after it broke out, burning the upper end of the grove and taking out a power line. Smoke saturated the walls of Alan's home, but his main losses were in his barn. From the outside, it looked untouched, but when Alan opened the door, a cloud of ash blossomed. The barn's corrugated aluminum acted like a convection oven, tempting the flames toward the crack beneath the barn door. Alan pointed toward the soot path, tracing a clockwise vortex from floor to ceiling. His finger tracked the corkscrew trail of charred photographs, tools, a motorcycle frame, and some wire art that Alan's father made. The model planes hanging from the ceiling looked like they'd taken flak. "This was an ass whooping," Alan said. "Take a look at this." Next to the door sat a cardboard box of photographs. Alan lifted it onto his workbench. This sat in that corner the whole time. Never knew until we discovered it in the cleanup. In one picture, a young version of my father pitched a horseshoe with one hand and gripped a beer with the other. In another, Alan and his half-brothers, my Uncle Dickie and my Grandpa Sandy, leaned over the hood of a '56 Chevy Gasser with the names Sinclair, Nelson, and Fogliadini painted on the side. Rifling through the box, we ventured deeper into our past, pictures belonging to Alden Fogliadini, Alan's father. The first picture was a massive platform that rolled along 4 sets of railroad tracks. Alan explained it was the Crawler Transporter, apparently the largest self-powered vehicle in the world upon completion in 1965, and used to transport the Saturn V rocket to the launch pad. In the next picture, a row of men in lab coats stood behind what looked like a go-kart, but was actually one of the original prototypes of the Lunar Roving Vehicle, or LRV, more commonly known as the Moon Rover. Standing on the right with his familiar spectacles hanging off his nose and a disheveled donut of hair around his bald crown was Foggy, a machinist with a high school education who didn't work directly for NASA but for General Motors. As we flipped through more pictures of the rover, intermingled with Polaroids from family cookouts, I considered how such a singular object had been born of the labor of people from such varied walks of life. I remembered the last time I saw Foggy, when I was 16 and visiting the ranch with my father. He didn't say anything about the moon or the rover. He was just watching the game and telling my father about how important it was that I play football. I'd never played football. With his country drawl and wild hair poking out beneath the brim of his Stetson, he scared me a little. Had the Thomas fire consumed Alan's barn, we would never have known these pictures existed. That a box of chemically saturated paper survived a burning barn almost suggested divine intervention, or the sheer luck that the flaming vortex had risen clockwise in the barn in deference to the Coriolis effect, preserving the little nook near the door. Whatever your conviction, their survival betrays the inexorability of entropy. This became increasingly apparent to me as I wandered Ventura in the aftermath of the fire, marveling at how much could be incinerated so quickly. So we can go on to the next slide. Thanks. So there's a second layer of inspiration to this story, and that is this man right here. His name is Guy F. Cooper. He was an electrical engineer and my mentor as a kid. And my mom also used to babysit his kids when she was in high school. And he was your real mad scientist. We would do experiments, like we started by astronomy, and my mom would take me over there Sunday nights, and we would look at the stars. And then gradually it became Thursdays after school, we would do experiments together. We built a hovercraft. I built an exploding cereal box with him for a movie I wanted to make. The most dangerous thing we built is the next slide. So this, as you can see, is a bunch of chopped up bike parts on a car muffler frame. And you can see an engine here, or a motor from a lawnmower. Now, a pulley would have gone up to this, and a propeller from an airplane was here. And I would sit right there and control it with these here. And it was supposed to be this propeller-driven car that would take us down the street. There was no protection on that propeller, and I rode it exactly one time, and Mrs. Cooper said, if you ever let Stuart ride that again, I will kill you. So that was my favorite thing that we built. Next slide. So I wanted to read a section of the book that was actually more of a dedication to him. And that's a chapter, and there's a number of chapters about him, but this one is more specifically a little bit of an ode. So it's called Mentors. Mr. Cooper swam around the Ventura Pier multiple times a week. Once a week, he'd ride his bike up the steep trail to Ojai and stop at Bart's books to peruse the science section. I didn't say that to book this, but it helped. He walked his dog along trails in the foothills, always carrying a trash bag and a grabber to pick up any garbage he saw. He was a volunteer swim coach for the Special Olympics. I can still hear the tune he whistled while he worked, which he couldn't whistle, but he'd go over and over and over. He tried to invent devices that would alert the world when tsunamis occurred and alert him and his wife when his mother-in-law leaned too far back in her chair. He traveled the world with his wife and sent me postcards from everywhere he went. He flew planes. He imagined deflecting asteroids by painting them white and pushing them with light. His library smelled like old books, machine grease, coffee, and dog. He pronounced robot, robot. He had 24 patents to his name. At 76, the doctor said he had the heart of a 24-year-old. He died of a brain aneurysm a few weeks later. I still picture him in his garage, rummaging through Folgers tins for nuts and bolts, making magic from spare parts. He wondered about everything. He wandered the world. He was a rover. Next slide. So, what is a rover? There's a whole lot of definitions that we can give to this thing. But let me ask the kids, what do you guys think a rover is? What do you think, Rudy?
I don't know.
That's a good answer.
It's a robot that goes around the moon collecting little chunks of rocks and moon dust.
That's a very good and very specific answer. Thank you guys very much. Now, if you move to the next slide, I'll show you a few examples of things that we've come to consider rovers. Here is Queen Elizabeth and a Land Rover. Next slide. Here's the book Red Rover. Next slide. Here's kids playing
That's
Red Rover, and this kid is just beating the shit out of those other kids. No, but I played with that passion. Next slide. This is a rover in front of a rover, and this is Wally. Next slide.
Wally.
Now, I'm going to try and make this video work, and I will give up eventually.
I've seen this
But-
so many times. I haven't. I'm not rewriting it.
See if I can do it that way, and then play, and then view. Do that thing so I play from turn slide. Or you can just. We might leave it here. There we go. It did not work.
I was ready for it.
Well, I was going to show you dancing robots. And I will, right now. Okay, we're giving up on that. All right. So some of you may recognize those dogs. Those were Boston Dynamics dogs. They were on Jimmy Kimmel dancing to Ionic Bionic. And in the newsletter, after this happens, maybe we'll send out a link to everybody somewhere. But those robots were made by this company that both, they were cutting edge in robotics, and they envisioned all these different ways that they wanted to use these machines, but they also envisioned different ways of using them in the world. So those machines would be used, they are currently used for SpaceX when it comes to going to make sure there's no, John, can you tell me the specific way this works?
Well, after they land the Starship, they send a robot dog out there and with a sniffer on it, and it sniffs the air to make sure all the harmful chemicals that might come from the exhaust are gone and make it safe for people to go out.
Thank you. And so they've also been used at Chernobyl currently to monitor the site there without exposing people to radiation. They're used in search and rescue operations. They have these myriad of uses, and we'll explore that a little more, and the book talks about that a lot. But turning to the next point I wanted to make about this, sorry, go back. Yeah, so the word planet comes from the Greek word I can't pronounce, planisthe, which means wanderer, wandering star. And you can see why they called them that in this time lapse. So this is Mars. And you can see it moving across the night sky night after night and making this what we call retrograde motion. And that's, if you thought that Earth didn't rotate around the sun, if you thought that our planet didn't move, you thought that there was just this funky star doing this sweeping motion. But of course, it turns out all of us are in motion, and that's just what it looks like as we revolve around each other. But you compare that to these fixed points of light on the outside, and that's why we call them the wanderers. Wanderers being another word for rover, and rover being another word for just someone who explores. So moving on to the next slide. Rovers are, in one definition, and this was, I'm stealing it from the guy who blurbed the book because he did a good job. Rovers are our mechanical avatars and assistants in hostile environments, but they are also, in their own way, our friends and family. Next slide. So, one of my favorite books that I researched while I was doing this is a very strange book by Jerzy Zalowski. He was a Polish author in 1914 who wrote the Lunar Trilogy. And the first of these books was called On the Silver Globe. And this book was the most popular work of science fiction in Europe at its time, but it never got translated into English. In fact, this version of it didn't come out until about 2 years ago. So this was Stanislaw Lem's favorite book as a child. It had a huge impact on Eastern European science fiction, but Americans largely don't know about it. There was a movie that Zulawski's grandson tried to make about it, but Poland fell into revolt, and they suppressed the movie, and it never got released in its entirety. He did publish a very bitter and spiteful half-complete version of it at some point that at the end just intersperses footage of people in public transit on Poland. I don't know why that was funny to him, but it was. But this is, the main point of the book is that there's this crew of people who decide they're going to travel to the moon in a rocket that's going to convert into a rover. So you can see them putting it together here. And this thing, they were going to travel to the far side of the moon where they believed that they were going to find a utopia. And they would just restart life in a whole new civilization. And from there, things go pretty poorly for them throughout the book, I'm not going to lie. But I would highly recommend it. But it's also the first instance that we have, again, as far as I know, of a rover in science fiction. Next slide. These are other examples that we had from different authors and science writers at the time. Next slide. Here's a unicycle type of one. Next slide. This one's really funky and was made by an actual engineer. He thought that this was a viable design for what we should send to the moon. It would telescope out here, and this is like a picture the size of like a Panzer tank. That's basically the scale of what it is here, and you can see the astronaut, for some reason, swinging from the edge there. Next slide. This was called the moon sack. I think they needed a branding person to work on that, but these two astronauts would walk in tandem, and if they wanted to turn, one would stop and the other one would keep moving, and that's how you rotated around each other. Next slide. Sorry, and again. But this is what we tend to think of, again, as a moon rover. Here we have the LRV. Next slide. Here is one of my favorites. This is the Lunokhod. This is not a science fiction prop. This is what the Russians put on the moon. It is an amazing piece of technology. Next slide. This is Sojourner, the first Mars rover. Thank you. There's always love for Sojourner. The next slide. This is Opportunity. Next slide. And this is either Curiosity or Perseverance. A really nerdy engineer would look at it and know it pretty immediately. I'm only normal nerdy. Okay, next slide. And you can get the scale of these different rovers as we built them up. So this is about the size of a microwave. Chess, you have the best. What did you describe that as?
The size of a golf cart.
Yeah, about the size of a golf cart. Very good.
And that's like the size of my mom's Beetle.
Yeah, exactly, like a Volkswagen Beetle. I was like, yeah. So again, these things get massive, and every time you jump up in scale, you have to remember these things are going to crash into an atmosphere that's about 1% the density of the atmosphere here on Earth. So it's not just a matter of like changing one little thing, you have to change everything as you scale up. Next slide. This is a funky one, and again, I'm thinking we're probably not going to be able to see the video for this either, but this was a DARPA project. So DARPA are the projects that are part of innovative NASA projects where they just want to experiment with the concept. And so a team proposed a rover that would be suitable for Venus. Now Venus, the temperatures are hot enough to melt lead. We have, I think, precisely 4 photos from the surface of Venus, actually, from anything that's landed there. The Russians were the first to make it, and their lander melted, I think, within like 45 minutes or something like that, some very short window of time. Now, this one is entirely mechanical, and the idea is that there would be a propeller on the back that would just catch the wind and move it forward, and then it would just cycle through instruments. Now, you have to make all of this out of parts that are so heat resistant that you can't use high-tech, high-powered computers because all of those things are super sensitive and work better in the cold. So they had to come up with chips that were not based in silicon, that were based in harder metals and stones. And if you'll move to the next slide, it's not going to work, but I'll just tell you what this is. This was an artist in I think Sweden or Norway or somewhere that I don't really distinguish in my mind, but he created kinetic sculptures. His name was Theo Jansen, and these giant things he called strand beasts, and if you watch them move, they catch the wind, and each of them functions and looks like a different species. So some look like snakes, some look like birds, some crawl around in just strange and surreal ways. It's really cool, and I highly recommend checking them out. But this was the inspiration for that Venusian rover. Next slide. And so this is from the book. As we can see here, though, we have the tracks on Mars of one of the rovers. And again, all these designs are so specific that a really keen engineer or someone who follows this stuff would be able to look at that track and tell you exactly which rover that was, because they're all so distinct. In fact, some of them in the treads have repeating patterns. So one of them, the repeating in Morse code spells out JPL for Jet Propulsion Laboratory over and over. So no matter the vantage point, when we look at the erratic movements of rovers across the surfaces of other worlds, can we help but connect them to our own migratory wanderings across the surface of this, our own planet? In both cases, our first steps or tracks across previously unencountered terrains always pave the way for others to follow. And with that comes the potential to bring the best and the worst of what our wanderings have delivered to every distant shore upon which we've ever landed. Which is just my way of saying that we should always be, or that this book is written both in awe of this technology and cautious about what it is our intent is when we're doing these things and the tension between those two purposes. Next slide. And that brings me to the third reading, which is about Sojourner. So I'll just say a little background on this rover. Sojourner wasn't even planned in the original Pathfinder mission, but when they, as they were putting it together at the last minute, it was part of an era at NASA called faster, better, cheaper. They were going to do things at a third of the cost in half the time, and that's where we come up with these kind of like fast missions. There wouldn't be secondary missions, and most of the parts for the rover or for the flights would be off the shelf or pre-designed. But at the last minute, someone proposed like, well, we can fit a little rover into this spot here, so why don't we try and pull that together? So they worked that out. It comes with a Radio Shack antenna. They literally went to Radio Shack and bought the antenna for it. It's a solar panel on the top, rocker bogie suspension, 6 wheels. And as they're putting it up there, they decide they're going to name it, right? They need to give it a name. And prior to this, all of the space missions had followed maritime tradition in naming vessels, which is that the captain of the ship names the vessel. Well, some smart folks at NASA spoke to some smart folks at the Planetary Society, which was founded by Carl Sagan, and currently is presided over by Bill Nye. And they said, well, why don't we make it an essay contest? So they do it for kids. They send out this essay contest. And this girl, Valerie Ambrose, she was a 11 Rover Sojourner troop after the pioneer who, a pioneer in, sorry, I'm blanking on all the details now, but she was basically someone who fled out of slavery and dedicated her life to getting other people out of slavery. And so that name stuck and it became Sojourner, and this was the very first rover that Americans sent into space. And one thing about this is that people really began to connect with it on a personal level, and as they talk about it, children would get really excited. So that's what this ending of this chapter is about. Each night, when Sojourner's battery died, the rover would go into a state called cold sleep, reviving again with the warmth of the sun each day. Engineers called this Lazarus mode. No one was certain how long Sojourner would remain operative after the death of its battery. Periodically, along its drives, the little rover would stop to send a heartbeat message back to the station just to confirm that it was still operational. On September 27th, Pathfinder's downlink didn't arrive as expected. Mission Control tried repeatedly to prompt the lander to no avail. From that point, it became impossible to know how much longer Sojourner remained active. It's possible that the rover endured long after the Pathfinder went down. It was programmed to drive to a more advantageous position if it couldn't communicate with the lander. Approaching without getting too close and circling as it tried to reconnect with its mothership, like a child nudging the body of a parent she doesn't realize has passed away. In an interview for On a Mission, JPL rover engineer Matt Wallace reflected on how children respond when they learn about Sojourner. Whenever we would speak to kids about the rover, their first questions were always, so when's the rover coming home? Who's going to go get it? When we talk about the lander and the rover, it's almost like it's your kids. We portrayed some sort of humanity onto that vehicle. We spoke about it as if it was some kind of living entity. And kids picked up on that. And they were like, we got to go bring it home. You can't leave it there. It's going to freeze. It's going to get cold. It's going to die. Some of the mission scientists preferred to imagine that Sojourner circled Pathfinder until it dug itself into a trench, like a moat around its mothership, but just rotating in an endless cycle and never dying out. It's a pretty thought, a childish one. Next slide. So here's just a couple fun things about the moon rover itself. This was a project that they had big ambitions for initially, and Kennedy, one NASA administrator, Robert Siemens, as they were coming through with these ideas, said Kennedy tasked us with putting a man on the moon, not providing him with a car. Next slide. Then Wernher von Braun, well, he actually said this beforehand, but he said you will probably be driving a car on the moon in his very first meeting with scientists. And I want to note, it's always important when you talk about Wernher von Braun that not only was he a Marshall Space Flight Director, he was also a Nazi. Next slide. So they envisioned, Wernher von Braun initially envisioned 2 Saturn V rockets for each launch. And in each of those launches, one would house the crew and the other would house a MoLab, a mobile laboratory, of which there were several prototypes made. Next slide. There's one that this was made here in Santa Barbara and then tested in Arizona. Next slide. And this one's funky. You'll notice that these wheels are looking flat, but that's because they envision them for a 1/6 gravity environment. Next slide. So basic layout aside, this is a GM product. This was made by GM, and when they downsized to just 1 Saturn V rocket per launch, they had to come up with a model that was going to fit into a little triangular wedge. So all of this folds up into a tight and compact space. And I use this photo to show you the Corvettes that nearly all of the Apollo astronauts drove. They got a deal from a dealership where they paid $1 for those Corvettes. So there's a few still around, but not many. And they would race those all around town. And that's the crew of, I don't know if it's Apollo 15, 16, or 17, but one of the crews there. So I like this quote here. It was that this was at one time a General Motors product, but also entirely not. It was called on across the country that no Earth car would encounter in conditions that would cripple any terrestrial vehicle instantly. Temperatures of minus 250 degrees in the shade and plus 250 in sunshine. A surface of clingy, abrasive dust that could foul any moving part, fierce solar radiation, and a constant shower of micrometeoroids, smaller than grains of sand but moving faster than bullets, all while wrapped in an airless vacuum. Next slide. And these descriptions, as I wrote, expose the point where reality and fantasy meet in the rover. This is the most alien craft that that looked more human than any other spacecraft. The Saturn V was this massive cathedral beyond the grasp of the individual. The lunar module looked more like an insect or a virus. Alan Bean called it the first spacecraft ever built. Even the astronauts in their spacesuits looked like aliens themselves. But the rover just looks like a car. And I'm just going to keep it on this image because you can really see the tire here. And these were hand woven out of piano wire on a loom with a bump stop in the middle to keep them from deforming too much. And as far as I understand, that was the part that our grandfather worked on. Next slide. So a big question that comes up in a lot of this is whether or not man should be exploring space. And I say must man explore not because I think only men can do it, but because when the final Apollo 17 crew landed on the moon, the first person to set foot said, as I sit here at the and admire the wonders of Hadley Rill, it becomes apparent to me that man must explore, and this is exploration at its finest. Next slide. And this quote here is from another one of the Apollo astronauts who talks about the overview effect, which is this broader concept of what happens when a person goes into space. And for a lot of people, this is what they talk about when they say why we should consider doing this for ourselves. There's a total, complete silence and that beautiful view, and the realization, of course, that you're going 25,000 miles per hour. You recognize that you're not there because you deserve to be there, you were just lucky. You're the representative of humanity at that point in history, having that experience, in a sense, for the rest of mankind. And this both points to the overview effect and points away from the overview effect, suggesting, again, that it's not so much what you are getting out of your individual experience of going to space, it's about what humanity benefited from this. It's about what photographs like that did for our consciousness and our perception of ourselves. Next slide. Another astronaut pointed out that he didn't think that robots would ever be able to do the things that, or perceive the things that humans can from space. David Scott wrote, "Will robots ever be able to experience the high adventure of exploring the heights of a new frontier? Not really." And I included this photo because it's also by another astronaut, or not this photo, sorry, this painting. It's by astronaut Alan Bean, who became a painter after he came back from the moon. And this is a self-portrait. When he went up to space, he was not really a believer. He didn't believe in God, and he thought, well, while I'm up there, I'm going to try and look and see if I can have a moment and address the Almighty directly. And so this is him doing that. And his answer was he didn't really feel anything. And so he named it, "Is Anybody Out There?" Next slide. And this is Elon Musk. So, Elon, as we think about the overview effect and the reasons that that we may all want to go into space, for Elon, it's this existential crisis of the future of humanity is going to bifurcate in two directions. Either it's going to become completely multiplanetary, or it's confined to one planet, and eventually there's going to be an extinction event. And for him, that extinction event looks something like this. So that is from Don't Look Up, if anybody has seen it. He's truly terrified of just like a massive explosion or something like that that's going to destroy the world. And so his urgency is go to another planet so that we have that lifeboat. But that lifeboat, at best, is only going to be a few people, and this is the least likely thing that will ever happen to our planet. In reality, the crisis that we're all facing looks more like this. So this is global temperature rises since 1980. As you can see, it's through the roof. If anybody here, and I don't think there's many, who want to deny that this is just a blip in the cycle, see the next slide. This is the last 1,000 years. And so, again, temperatures moderately steady up until the Industrial Revolution, and this is 20 years old. So just take that and keep moving it straight up. And the reality is, whatever we do on Mars isn't going to change this. Going into space and exploring is going to help. We know this because we're in space. We know this because there are satellites orbiting Earth giving us this data in high resolution in real time. And so it is important that we go to space. It is not important that Elon Musk goes to Mars. Although it's been pointed out to me, Elon Musk has never been to space. And that's neither one way or another, but I did in an early version of this draft just assume that he did. So I had to edit that before I published it. Next slide, please. This is Chernobyl. This is one of the uninhabitable places on Earth that we have done through our own technology. And so we are fully capable of leaving Earth an uninhabitable wasteland, although there's a lot about the animals surviving and thriving in spite of us. Those who may not be familiar with this whole scene, you can see the actual reactor. It's encased in that sarcophagus up in the distance there. Next slide. This is the top of the Chernobyl reactor. And this is STR1. So the top of the reactor after the explosion was it was such a massive radiation zone that people couldn't really go up there. And we'll actually talk about a little more of that in a second. But one of the things they wanted to do first was try and clear the rubble away by bringing in robots. So they actually called in the crew that made that funky Russian rover to design in 6 months, maybe 3 months, a rover that they could send onto that roof and remotely operate. And it was the same crew who operated the moon rover for Russia who would operate this on the reactor. Now, this only survived for, I think, a matter of weeks before the radiation destroyed it. And after that, Russia had to incorporate what they called biorobots, which was a whole bunch of people, literally thousands of people, that they shielded from head to toe in lead and sent onto the roof to work in shifts of 15 to 30 seconds. You'd go out there, pick up a rock, drop it over here, run off, and then you were officially done. And if you stayed longer than that, you were going to die. So, next slide. This was a video of that whole process, but it's not going to work. Next slide. Now, I want to bring these up too because this is the exact same technology that made those dancing robots from earlier. Only this one is used in the military. And this one here is used by the Israeli military, although all militaries at this point that are advanced enough have something like this, to patrol and fire. This is capable of shooting bullets at human beings. Next slide. This is one that is traversing the Gaza border as we speak. What's terrifying about this one is that it's capable of firing automatically. That is, without the approval of a human on the other end. If it senses a threat, it can shoot. I'm not putting these up here to make a statement on that particular war. I'm putting it up here to make a statement on what we choose to do with our technology. We can have these rovers dance. We can have them save us from nuclear annihilation, but we can also just have them as things that continue to kill each other. Next slide. So, as we consider everything that we're doing in space, I think that we have to remember that the Earth is a living, breathing being adrift between two corpses. One of those corpses being Mars, which died in the cold essentially and froze out, and another being Venus, which was runaway greenhouse gases that eventually created a hellscape that is beyond anything we've ever seen. We know about those two things because of everything that we've invested into space exploration. And those two planets taught us a hell of a lot about the Earth. Carl Sagan's studies of Venus are what taught us about the greenhouse effect on Earth. He wasn't certainly the only person, but his writing on that popularized this idea that if you pump a lot of carbon into the atmosphere, it's going to heat up. We're not really at risk of becoming Venus, but we're at risk of becoming a place where a lot of people will die in heat waves every year, where sea level rise will flood out low-lying islands and low-lying cities, and that is the future we face. And for some reason, Elon Musk thinks that this is our salvation, which is basically trying to revitalize a corpse, and it's not going to happen. Next slide. And he writes about this here for a couple of reasons. This is Carl Sagan, for those of you who don't know, who are younger. This is my hero, one of them. There will be a time when all of Mars is explored, and he talks a bit about that. But he says, what then? What shall we do? There are so many examples of human misuse of the Earth that even phrasing the question chills me. And he goes on to talk about how even if we find life on Mars, that means we should leave it alone. We should leave it to the Martians, even if they're microbes. Next question, next slide. And here you can see the hellscape from WALL-E. And I want to make a point here, this is from the book, that rovers are machines designed to transport us through inhospitable environments or to travel there in our place. Yet, simultaneously, more of the world is receding from habitability. And a fun fact about WALL-E is that the team who made that movie traveled to Chernobyl as they were making the movie to study it, to get an idea of what that sort of place would look like. Next slide. So here's Chernobyl, and next slide, here's WALL-E. So this is our little rover hero working to save the world and making the point that it's not going to be him who's going to be capable of doing this. The only thing that we can do is to maintain the habitability of this planet for ourselves, because there is no planet B. There is no alternative. Next slide. And I want to leave us with one last little bit of writing and this quote from Carl Sagan. So, the vast distances that separate the stars are providential. Beings and worlds are quarantined from one another. The quarantine is lifted only for those with sufficient self-knowledge and judgment to have safely traveled from star to star. And in my view, Elon Musk says we just need the technology to have a backup plan, to send us to another place, to make us a star-faring civilization. But Sagan is saying it doesn't matter how much of that you do if we're still assholes. You have to get rid of the asshole part of yourself, and then you can travel to other planets and actually bring something good with you. And so I want to read from the last chapter of the book here, called Eulogy, which is partly about Mr. Cooper's funeral, but I'm going to skip a little bit of that for time, and just sort of read this last little summation here. This book is full of criticism, but that criticism shouldn't mask the joy, the curiosity, the thrill of discovery, and the awe of what we as a species have accomplished. Mr. Cooper opened my understanding to that world, and even as we confront increasingly precarious global circumstances, I can't help but maintain some of the optimism he imparted to me. It's the same sort of optimism that Carl Sagan had, a sense of realism, a knowledge that humans have the intellect and capacity to solve our problems, and that the solutions to our most profound challenges are waiting in black boxes for the right question to be asked. I don't know if there is some madness gene that makes us set off for the unknown. I'm more inclined to think that humans really do just have a restless curiosity. If we didn't, we wouldn't make music, sketch the wilderness, write poetry, sing songs. For some, that curiosity manifests itself as whittling away at a piece of balsa wood while sitting on a front porch rocking chair. For others, it appears as an urge to set sail. And still for others yet, it's the desire to build a machine that can fend for itself on another world. Civilization has always been in tension between the creative and destructive force. That's the very definition of chaos and cosmos, disorder and order. A rover, whether operated by a human or driven by its internal programming, is always on the frontier between those two zones. It brings with it the capacity for so much beauty and so much despair, and always it is entangled with the world from which it came. Whatever our intentions in the stars, we have to survive long enough to fulfill them. It's possible to send rovers to other star systems since they would be unburdened by the inconvenience of needing to stay alive, and advances in artificial intelligence may further humanize our robot emissaries. But by the time one of those rovers reaches the next star, who's to say that the nation that launched it, or the civilization it was part of, or even its entire home planet will still be there to receive the message upon return? Every single planetary rover has carried with it an ephemeral payload of national ambitions, personal dreams, fears, interests, and prejudices. The pride of success or the contributions to science should not be dismissed because of political entanglements. The entanglements are always there for India, China, the United States, Russia, Japan, and every rover from every country and every private company to come. Every journey into space is pregnant with boundless possibility and peril, because every rover is just a product of the civilization and the species that built it. Our terrestrial and cosmic destinies will always be entangled. Mr. Cooper was always someone who believed that technology was mostly amoral, subject to the ethics of those who possess it. I think I've inherited that belief from him. I'm not afraid of atomic energy or artificial intelligence. I'm afraid of the intentions of those who possess these tools. I'm afraid of human nature, as afraid of it as I am in awe of it, and it's for that reason that I fear what we will bring with us to other worlds. I think I have to return once more to that cosmic desire to transcend humanity, that Earth is the cradle, and perhaps we are not meant to remain in the cradle forever, but we cannot leave the cradle without maturing. Otherwise, the benign cruelty of the universe will consume us, or the malignant cruelty of our species will devour those we encounter. That transcendence doesn't come at the expense of Earth. It arrives with our realization of the fragile beauty of our home planet, and that we are, more than anything else, Earthlings. Thank you.
Maybe let's take one or two questions before you sign some books.
Sure.
Anyone has a question they want to ask and think we're answering them?
Yeah, Dad?
Yeah, I heard recently mentioned in the media about the near future moon exploration and mention of a rover that will be used on Mars. I guess there's also going to be the first woman astronaut going up there. So you got any information on what that vehicle might look like?
Yeah, and I meant to put a picture of it in here, but it's. Do you remember who's making that rover by any chance, John? They just announced it like this week or last week.
No.
Might be Jackson.
Oh, no, it's Japan.
Yeah, Jackson.
Japan's doing it. It's going to be completely pressurized.
Yeah, exactly. So that rover is actually going to look a lot like what those early ones in this presentation were, the moon truck, like actual transporter of a larger crew. So it's pretty impressive what they're doing. And a big reason they can do that is because all those technologies are so much lighter now than they would have been then. But yeah, so that's going to be a big part of that mission. And the crew, again, they're intentionally aiming to have a more diverse crew to put more faces on the moon, which I think benefits all humanity by reflecting humanity in space and makes it more valuable. There's a quote in here from Gil Scott-Heron, a famous poem called Whitey on the Moon. And it says, a rat done bit my sister Nell, but Whitey's on the moon. Her face and arms began to swell, but Whitey's on the moon. So diversifying that presence helps everybody feel like, okay, I get why we should invest in these things. And I think it's very exciting to have that next generation of technology up there to create these really robust and exciting missions. Yeah.
I heard from some, well, it might be fake, it was online, but that some scientists believe, even found evidence that even if we did
Inhabit?
habitats on Mars, that we would only be able to exist there for about 4 years.
That's pretty accurate. Everything that we would bring to, think about Mars the way we think about Antarctica, or the way we think about the moon, or the way we would think about the original colonists coming to the United States from Europe. A lot of them died. And when people go to Mars for the first time, some of them are going to die. They might die in transit, they might die when they get there, and I know that sounds really bleak, but once you get there, everything is going to rely on coming from Earth. And so it takes 2 years for a mission to Mars, basically. Every 2 years you get an alignment. So they're going to go there, and then it's going to be another 2 years before the next supply can come through. So 4 years is the amount of time that you can have a mission on Mars that is self-sustaining. After that, you're going to need something from Earth, because you can't really grow anything there except those potatoes, which is true, that can be done, but like you're going to be extremely limited. So yeah, you're absolutely right. That is one thing the internet got right this week. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I think it was 2026, California is supposed to not sell gas cars anymore. I'm not sure the year. So in my mind, I'm thinking, well, does that set some sort of precedence to help global warming? But it's, I'm looking at that chart you had there, and I'm thinking, is that overpopulation? Is that all of our phones are plugged in?
I can jump to the answer to that if you're okay with it. So it's good that we're moving to electric cars. Electric cars are not a a panacea. They're not an end-all solution to this. The big problem is that we use a lot of energy. And it doesn't matter if it goes to your car, to your phone, to your house, to whatever, we use a lot. And so the fact is, we just need to use less. We need to have more efficient lives. We need more efficient homes. We need more public transportation. It's okay for someone to have a Tesla. In fact, I think it's okay for me to have my gas-guzzling Jeep Cherokee. But you can't have everybody having all those cars, relying on them every day. You should take that money and build high-speed rail. You should build all these things that are going to reduce our footprint. And also, we have to change our lifestyle. There are going to be sacrifices to be made, because increasingly we're seeing it in our time and we're going to see it into the future. The choices we make with our energy lead to the loss of lives of other people here and around the world. And that's not going to change. Now, I'm not an expert on this at all, but in studying this subject for so long, you become inevitably entangled within those two things and realize it's a choice between where we put that energy. But Sagan also said, when people would say, well, why are we investing in space if we have all these problems on Earth? And he said, we have enough money to solve both those problems. We have enough money to go into space. We live in the richest civilization in the history of the world. And it's not a matter of cost for us to be able to feed everybody, to clothe everybody, to reduce energy input, and to send a rocket to the moon. The whole space program takes about 1% of the federal budget, compared to 6% for the military. I don't know exactly, but you could cut that by 1% and double our spending on research and development. So it's a matter of societal choices and of societal values. So I think it's great that we're going to build electric cars. I think it's great that we're going to do this whole energy transition, but that even means mining lithium and all these other things that are going to cause pain in other communities. And so you have to decide, how much pain are additional cars worth? How much pain is it worth to have giant houses? Can we live smaller? Can we live closer? Can we like our neighbors? Those sorts of things are going to make a difference. And sometimes we're just not going to like our neighbors. That's just true. All right, maybe one more, if it's out there. Yeah, Ronnie?
I don't know, kind of just a joke.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, in school one day, and I was like, we always watch this, like CNN News, and it was just another report that Elon's rocket failed.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, I've always had this running joke, it's like, I said it, and I'll say it again, God does not want Elon on Mars.
He does keep blowing up his rocket, so I do think he's trying to keep him on Earth. All right, thank you guys so much.